Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a webinar to discuss unemployment insurance and our reopening efforts in the state of Kentucky. I want to first of all welcome everyone from around Western Kentucky with us here today. All of our friends from the Owensboro region to the Purchase region. Hello to our friends in Paducah, Hopkinsville, and Murray. And we're always glad to be a part of things with you. And for people living in those communities, we have an honor to work with your chamber presidents, some of the most dedicated and hardworking people whom I've ever had a chance to meet. So welcome to all of you, and we will welcome now our presenter, Josh Benton, who is Deputy Secretary of Workforce and Education Cabinet. Josh kicked us off with this, with COVID-19, with our unemployment webinar, where he walked us through the specifics of getting our employees on that. And now he's here with the other side for the reopening piece, and how we walk through that as employers and employees on getting back to work the right way. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you, Candace. I appreciate the opportunity to join, obviously not just the Owensboro Chamber, but multiple chambers across the western portion of the state. It's a good way, especially in these times where I'm not able to get around and address everybody in person. To be able to do it through this venue is just extremely helpful, and just appreciate that the opportunity to do that. So obviously, as Candace said, the topic today is very different than what we talked about a few weeks ago, about a month and a half ago. And that, then it was, what are all the changes taking place to unemployment insurance when it comes to eligibility, and that sort of thing, and how can people apply, and who qualifies, and all of that, to more of a conversation of returning to work, and how do those processes flow. That's obviously critically important right now, that as we are seeing more employers reopen and call their employees back to work, for those that do get called back, how do those benefits stop? Those are important things that everybody needs to know. But just to give a little bit of an update on just where we are on claims and that sort of thing. Last week, the unemployment rate for the state was released at 15.4% for the month of April. We do think it's probably a little higher than that. It's getting into some of the details about how that is calculated. The unemployment rate captures those who were insured by unemployment insurance prior to their job separation. So that does not include a good number of people who were like self-employed into that rate. So while 15.4 is a good barometer for us, we know it's probably higher than that. To give some context, during the recession, the highest unemployment rate that Kentucky was ever at was around 11%. It was just a little bit below that, between 10.5 and 11%. So for most of us, this is the highest rate that we've ever seen, and we're obviously hopeful that this is a short-lived situation. As it relates to unemployment insurance, a lot of things that are going on right now include focusing on, obviously there's new claims coming in. Those claims, the new initial claims numbers are down. That's a good thing. We're focusing on some of those claims that had been held up in March, and particularly March and April. The good news is we've started seeing some of those get cleared up. At the last number, we had around 10,000 March claims remaining, and about 30,000 April claims remaining that had not had a determination made on them yet. That is just an example. Friday, we were at 15,000 for March and 40,000 for April. So just over the past few days, we've started seeing some decreases in those numbers, and we'll continue to see that as we've done since the beginning of this, repurposed staff and partner agency staff to help us with our greatest need in processing claims. But we're also, turning an emphasis to making sure that the other portions of, uh, especially the Department of Workforce Investment, are able to help people get the training and job placement services that they need, whether that's in the Career Development Office in partnership with a lot of the career centers around the state, whether it's uh, vocational rehabilitation or our employer and apprenticeship office. All of those really focused on understanding the needs of employers and the training needs that might need to be involved to get people back to work. So we're ramping some of those things back up, moving some of our employees back to their normal jobs, if you will, to make sure that we're still able to provide the full scope of services within our cabinet as it relates to workforce. So um, as it relates to reopening, so these are just some things that we want to talk about this morning. Some questions that we've been receiving is, from employers, from individuals, the question of, you know, do employees have to come back to work if their employer calls them back? And generally, that answer is yes. I think it's really important to point out that if an employer calls someone back to work and they refuse, that's fraud. And we don't want people to commit fraud. We know that there's been some exceptions made, and I'll talk about those. But generally, if an employer calls someone back, they need to return to work. That's critically important. And there's things that employers can do to report those return to work dates, and there's things that individuals can do as well. The simple thing for individuals is if you go back to work, stop requesting benefit payments. that's the simplest thing to do. Um, we know also that some people are going to go back to work and they're going to go for less hours. That means less pay. In those circumstances, when they go to request their benefit payments, they can report any wages that were earned, and we'll recalculate those benefits. And there's a possibility that an individual can still get a prorated UI benefit. But those are built into the system, and it's really important that individuals report that information when they go back to work. They have to report their wages, and in many cases, if they're going back to work full time, they're going to earn more, and it's going to just disqualify them because they earn too much to receive unemployment insurance. But if it's a reduced, the callback is reduced in terms of hours and wages, there's a chance that they can still receive a partial payment, a prorated payment, and so they need to report that. And so that's important. But employers, at the beginning of this, we didn't know what returning to work would look like. So in a normal circumstance, if it was a temporary layoff, the employer would provide that individual that's getting laid off with a return to work date. And so when they filed their claim, they would have a return to work date, and that's when their benefits would stop. Because we didn't know, and really employers had no real sense of firm return to work dates, we did not require a return to work date to be submitted. So what we've done now, we've allowed for a couple of mechanisms for employers to report return to work dates for their employees that have been laid off. So on the kcc.ky.gov website, if you scroll down on that page, there's some videos. Just below the videos, there's a link where it says employer return to work. Click on that, and it's going to take you to the place you need to go to report those return to work dates. It's on a page where employers, a lot of self-service. So if you've had to file UI taxes, if you're an employer that pays into the UI system, you'll be familiar with this page. But on the sidebar there on the options, there is a link for returning to work, and you just log in, and you can do a couple of things. You can either report return to work dates individually, or you can upload if you have a lot of employees, you can upload those employees and their information. What we'll do then is that auto populates into the system and assigns a return to work date for those individuals. And on that date, the employees' their benefit payment will stop on that return to work date. So there's also, we've had the question of, how can you report fraud if you know that you have employees that have found a way to continue UI benefit payments? Yes, there's a link on that as well where you can report suspected fraud, and we'll investigate that to make sure that things are being done as they should be. The other way that employers can do that if they e-claim. So if there was a mass layoff and an employer submitted an e-claim, just in the course of that process, the people on our staff that you've been working with, just let them know about return to work dates, that you want to submit return to work dates. And in the course of your e-claim process, that can be done as well. So, two ways there. If you do an e-claim, you can do it in that process, or you can go to the self-service page for employers and submit return to work dates. We've had a couple of questions of, what if, I typically was not an employer that paid into the UI system. How do I do that? There's a way you can register on that page as well, so that you can get login information and submit those return to work dates. So it's really important that this happens. It helps prevent fraud. It helps people helps prevent individuals from claiming and receiving benefits when they're not supposed to be. And we get the question a lot, what if somebody just doesn't want to return? Obviously there's $600 additional dollars a week that are tacked on to a UI benefit payment right now. But it doesn't change the circumstance of, whether or not someone has to return when their employer calls them back. There's a couple of exceptions that I want to point out that the CARES Act does allow for. The first is child care, and really it's dependent care. It's just not child care. At this point in time, Kentucky's child care facilities are not able to reopen yet. And so we do know that individuals cannot, they may not be able to return to work if they don't have a child care option. So if that's the case for someone, when they go in to request benefits or report wages for their benefits, and they have a return to work stop on that, they do have the opportunity to request an exception for child care and dependent care. So if their child care facility or the dependent care facility has not been opened and they have to take care of a dependent and that's preventing them from going to work, they can request that exception. What that's going to do is, if they are in the regular UI program, it's going to transfer them to pandemic unemployment assistance. It's going to take them out of the regular UI program and move them into the other program. The other question that we get is, what about someone who is at risk? They're considered by the CDC guidelines at risk. The CARES Act does provide an exception, but they have to have a doctor-ordered quarantine. And so someone just can't say, I don't feel safe, or because of my health, or I'm at risk, and self-certify that. It has to be doctor-ordered. And we're not going to restart their benefit payments until we're able to verify that a doctor has actually ordered that they have to self-quarantine because of health concerns that are preventing them from return to work. So those are the two primary exceptions. All of the other exceptions that the CARES Act provides really fall into the category of, the business being closed and that sort of thing. But those two, dependent care and falling in an at-risk category that is going to require a quarantine, are the the two exceptions. And still an employer in that circumstance has the right to appeal through that, that process that's on the self-service website to appeal or report fraud. If an employee says they don't have child care and the employer knows they don't have any children, or they're not taking care of anyone at home, they can appeal that, and we'll look into it, and if their benefits need to be stopped, we'll do that. So, but it's the easiest way for employers to help us out in this situation is to go to that site, report to return to work dates, either through the site or through the e-claim process, and that will trigger just the stop of benefit payments. And so those are the biggest, that's the biggest piece of information as it relates to returning to work. There were some questions that were pre-submitted, and I think I covered some of those. But a couple of things that I noticed here, just want to address. Obviously, just refusing to come back to work because they want to continue on the benefits or continue to receive the $600 a week is not a good reason for not returning to work. It's if the employer calls them back, they have to come back, as I mentioned. And then there was also a question about, are employers responsible for these additional benefits that the CARES Act, whether it's pandemic unemployment assistance or the additional $600? The answer to that is no. And employers are not going to be charged for those payments. Those are paid 100% by the CARES Act and the federal government. So I think that's important for employers to know. And then again, just a question about if you've never logged into this self-service site, there's a place where you can register to get a password and a PIN. So I know a couple of others that are on here. If you're a small business and you are a business of any kind and you're allowed to reopen, but you're not ready to do it yet, do your employees stay on UI? The answer to that is yes. They're going to stay on UI for 39 weeks or until they get called back to work. So even if you do reopen and you don't call everyone back, those individuals that are not called back can stay on UI until you do call them back. So I think those are the majority of the pre-submitted questions. But Candace, if there's any additional, I'm happy to take those.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Benton. One that was submitted, there's a couple of people who have former employees who were filing against their accounts, but since that employee had left, they'd worked at other places. So how does an employer deal with that?
Sure. So, they can protest. It's that one. What we've learned with UI over the past few weeks is that nothing is cut and dry, and that most things are complicated. That's one of the more complicated issues, is if it's a former employee that is still on UI. Now, if their employer has called them back and they're not going back to work, they can report that, as I mentioned. And that's probably the best way to handle that. Obviously, if they haven't been called back to work yet, then they're going to continue to receiving UI payments.
But if they're filing against an employer that, for example, if someone was on that didn't work for the chamber but they've already worked for 3 other previous employers after they left the chamber, would they still be able to file against the chamber, or should I file a fraud charge against that person?
If I think a lot of that's going to be contingent upon if they've been called back to work by their most recent employer.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
And that's kind of the hinge on that, is if their most recent employer has called them back. And if they have, and they're not going back to work, then yes, absolutely, report that, and it'll be something to look into. But if they haven't been called back to work yet, for regular UI, we do look back at their employment over the previous 6 quarters. So there are some previous employers that are on the hook there. the protest period is usually when you know, the initial claim is filed. And so if there was a separation issue from a previous employment, not the most recent, and that those employers protested during that 13-day protest period upon the initial filing.
Okay, thank you. Well, we haven't received any more questions besides the ones that you've already answered. We appreciate it so much. And this webinar will be replayed on all of our websites. And Deputy Secretary, thank you for your work. We know that you're burning the candle at both ends, and we just appreciate your service to our Commonwealth.
Glad to do it, and hopefully we're going to see more and more people going back to work, and hopefully this information just about reporting the return to work dates is going to help, both employers and employees out there. It's vital information. It's outside of the norm in many circumstances as it relates to UI. So, but obviously, if there's any questions after this from any of the chamber directors out there, feel free to send them to our office, and we'll make sure we turn around and get those answers back to everybody.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone watching. We know that you're out there rebuilding and pushing us forward, and we appreciate all of your work too, and we look forward to getting back to normal. Take care.
Thanks.